Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
I'm Samuel Goldberg. I'm the Public Policy Manager at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. I'm joined by Gina Rizk, who is the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Portland Metro and Salem. We're going to be presenting today about a wide variety of issues that older adults face in housing. So this is we're going to cover a little bit of disability rights. We're going to cover aging in place and how fair housing laws can protect older adults stay in their homes or ensure that their rights are maintained wherever they may be living at any given time. First, a little bit about us. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon is a statewide civil rights organization. We work to proactively promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion. And we do that through kind of two tracks. There's the education side. That's what Gina and I are doing today. So we go around the state delivering presentations like this or doing technical assistance or outreach to tenants to know their rights, to home buyers to know their rights, as well as to housing providers to know their responsibilities and jurisdictions as well. So fair housing laws, very broadly, are civil rights laws that promote equal access to housing. They make it illegal for housing providers to discriminate against certain groups in any housing transaction. And this is different than landlord-tenant law, which are like the rules and policies around living in a given place. It can drift into fair housing law if those rules and policies are being applied differently depending on the person, which we'll get into a little bit, but as a body of law, it is separate. So fair housing is the right of all people to be free from illegal discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing. So in rental housing, which is makes up the majority of the issues that we see, these laws cover the application process, tenancy, and move out. So the whole housing process, you are covered by fair housing law. And the discrimination is treatment on the basis of any of the protected classes. So at the federal level, under federal fair housing law, that means race, color, familial status, sex, which now includes domestic violence, gender identity, and sexual orientation as of 2021, religion, national origin, and disability. Now, of these, there's two that are a little unique, and that's familial status and disability, which were both added under the 1988 Fair Housing Amendments Act. So with the other protected classes, we all fall into those, right? Every single one of us cannot be discriminated against on the basis of race or national origin. But with familial status and disability, those protections are one way because membership in those groups is conditional, right? So you have special protections if you have children under 18, or you have fair housing protections if you have a disability. The same cannot be said the other way. So if you do not have a disability, then you are not covered by the protection of disability. And it seems like a small difference, but it does make a big impact in how those laws end up getting applied. There's more nuance than in the other groups. In Oregon, we have a few other protected classes. So marital status, source of income, that was a big addition in 2014. That means things like Section 8 payments, agency rent payments, TANF, SSI, SSDI, those have to be treated the same as income earned from an occupation in housing. And sexual orientation and gender identity. I mentioned those are protected at the federal level now as of 2021. We have had a separate protection at the state level since 2008. And there may be additional protected classes in your jurisdiction. And we've got a list on locally protected classes on our website. So who must comply? Everyone. Everyone involved in the home buying process, in the rental process, jurisdictions, as I mentioned, advertising media, right? If a newspaper is running a classified ad that has openly discriminatory content in it, then they could be liable for fair housing violations. So everyone involved in housing has to comply with fair housing law. And fair housing laws apply in dwellings. So what is considered a dwelling? Sometimes it's a little vague. So very broadly, it is occupied or designed or intended for occupancy as a residence by one or more families. So that's, obviously things like single family housing, apartments, manufactured homes, floating homes, right? All of those are definitely dwellings. But then there's a gray area when it comes to things like shelters or hotels or RV parks. The main consideration is how long is someone staying there, and is this their primary place of residence? And so there's a few ways to establish that. You can be like someone's paying utility bills at a location, or someone's getting their mail delivered to a particular location. That's pretty good evidence that that is their dwelling. And so fair housing laws would apply. After the massive wildfires that we had in 2020, 2021, obviously a lot of displaced people were staying in hotels. And at a certain point, they had been staying in the hotels for so long that it transitioned from being, just a temporary residence to an actual dwelling. And so fair housing laws started applying. And so this was an issue that we were definitely dealing with in 2020, 2021, where hotel owners were having to follow fair housing law for the first time and had no experience with that. Limitations of fair housing, it is not always going to protect. It can help people with particular problems that directly have to do with a protected class status. But things like rental references, having a criminal history, having a bad credit history, those are not necessarily protected unless they can be shown to be problems on the basis of a protected class. As well, residents who violate their rental agreement, it's not going to make it so that people don't have to follow the, rental policies that they agree to when they move into housing. So not paying the rent on time, disturbing the neighbors, damaging property, that kind of thing. Now, fair housing has been the law of the land for over 50 years, but obviously we still know that discrimination exists. We also know that it might not be as overt as it used to be. It might not be as out in the open. Sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's a little more under the surface. And so we have to be aware of red flags, things that might be an indication that discrimination is going on. So things like a refusal to rent, sell, or finance, someone who's applying for housing or buying a home, they might not know right off the bat if they were denied because of discrimination or not. If they believe that they should have qualified for this, then that could be a red flag. And, absolutely worth reaching out to someone like the Fair Housing Council to look into it further. If a housing provider is giving out false or inconsistent information, if you were told, oh, we don't have any units available, and then a day later someone of a different background is told, oh yeah, we have a few units available, that's a classic example of that. Things like linguistic profiling and not returning inquiry calls, that became a really big issue over the pandemic when so much was done over the phone. We know that there was a lot of discrimination against people with different accents or for whom English was not their first language. Steering is the classic one. And so that's things like property managers or realtors directing people to a particular neighborhood and away from other neighborhoods. And that's how a lot of segregation remains in place today, is by these practices of steering. And then things like discriminatory advertising. That's something that I think we'll talk about a little bit later in the context of senior housing. Things that can be discriminatory on the basis of disability by use of certain kind of code language. So the real key takeaway with all of these things is that housing providers really just need to be consistent. They need to be consistent in their screening procedures and in the criteria that they apply for applicants. So during tenancy, red flags can show up as a lot of the same things. So things like discriminatory statements, applying the policies in a landlord-tenant agreement inconsistently, between different people. Discriminating against residents with protected class guests. That's a really big one. Guests do have some protections under fair housing law. We absolutely have a protection on that basis. Increased frequency of inspections, right? Landlord or a property manager just really making a tenant's life difficult by constantly sending inspections after them. Harassment, threats, or intimidation or coercion, that's a huge percentage of the calls that we get. About 20% are harassment, either by the landlord or property manager or by a neighbor. And if the neighbor is also, in the same building as as you, and then the property manager does have some responsibility to put a stop to that harassment. Same thing goes for homeowners associations. If it's two neighbors in the same homeowners association, then the HOA has some responsibility to put a stop to that. And then during move out, retaliation, and termination notices, evictions, of course, like that's also a huge percentage of the inquiries that we get. So how do we know if it's housing discrimination? Well, the key things are, is this treatment based on protected class? That's the really key thing. Maybe it's not based on protected class. You could still be protected by landlord tenant law or various other protections, but for it to be a fair housing violation, it has to be on the basis of one of those protected class statuses we talked about. So it's really important to keep a paper trail, or things like texts or emails, anything that is any communication that you have that could be evidence later on of fair housing violations. So again, housing providers need to be consistent. That's the really important thing to remember. I'll take a brief stop for questions. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yes, we have a bus tour. We have a bus tour that's been going on since 2008. It goes around the city of Portland, and we get to talk about instances of discrimination and segregation that shaped the city as it is today. We also have a kind of follow-up newsletter to that talks about the different, expands on the stories that we talk about in the bus tour, as well as talking about new stories. You do not need to have gone on the bus tour to receive that. So if you're interested in a more like history-focused newsletter, you can absolutely sign up for that. Thank you for mentioning that. Should have, explained that. All right. Yeah.
Is there a certain time limit that you have to report?
Yes. Do you know what it is?
So you have 2 years to file with a private attorney. for instances of housing discrimination and up to 1 year to report with bully or HUD.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the housing crisis in Oregon, and which is definitely relevant to the kinds of discrimination that we're seeing. Number one, that is relevant to the questions that, or to the topics that we're talking about today, is that big number that the state housing wage, in order to afford fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, and be paying 30% or less of your income, you would need to be making $29.72 an hour. So if you're an older adult on a fixed income, there's no way that you are getting $29.72 an hour unless you have or the equivalent of that, unless you have a very significant pension or something like that, which is less and less common. So yeah, that's a really key thing, and that's part of why those source of income protections are so necessary in this state. So currently, and I'm sure you're going to be hearing a lot about this in the next few days, it is estimated that Oregon's housing supply is short roughly 140,000 homes. It is one of the states with the lowest supply of rentals affordable to people at or below poverty levels, which includes a lot of older adults. Oregon has the highest percentage of homeless families that are living completely unsheltered. That also has, big tie-in with older adults, because oftentimes when the younger family, the youth become homeless, well, they need a place to stay, and sometimes they're going to end up staying with the older adults, which can further burden those households in terms of cost. And unhoused families increased by 27% between 2020 and 2022. So that is, during a time when we had an eviction moratorium, and yet unsheltered housing or unsheltered families were also increasing because of that increase in costs. So nationwide, 11.2 million older adults are cost burdened in housing, meaning that they spend more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. And that also, has a major impact on older adults who have other costs that are higher. So things like medical care, that's the really big one. And so any increase in that threshold that they're paying for housing is going to eat into what they can afford for other things. 55% of those age 80 and over report at least one disability. This is going to be a really notable thing when we get into reasonable accommodations and modifications. 13% of adults age 75 and over living alone could afford assisted living without dipping into assets. So for older adults who simply cannot remain in their homes, have to end up in assisted living, it's a very small percentage that could afford to do that without eating into their savings. So aging in place, the vast majority of older adults live in their homes. This is for age 65 and older. As you can see that this green is living alone, and then it's almost half, or almost 2/3 that are with a spouse only or living alone. And that creates some really unique needs, because as these individuals remain in their home, it's even more important that they have access to accessible housing, because they're going to be much more likely to have a disability, and so on and so forth. It can really create a cycle here. And this is kind of a look into the future. The home ownership rate among households age 50 to 64 have fallen. So there's going to be fewer and fewer people who are reaching those advanced ages who have that kind of housing stability, who are able to stay in their own homes. So as these individuals, get over 75, which that threshold is really significant for, predicting how, if that person's going to have a disability. They are less and less likely to be owning their own home at that time. So as of 2019, only 47% of those age 65 to 79 and 54% of those over 80 occupy homes with single floor living and a no step entry into the home. So this is the bare minimum of accessibility. As you can see, it's, less than half for those under 80 who have access to those kinds of facilities. Many households also do not qualify for financial assistance for home modifications due to income limits. Their income might be too high, but they also, those kinds of modifications can be very expensive. So they might not have the resources to afford the modifications that are necessary. So why is this a fair housing issue? Well, for renters, things like reasonable modifications can be used to address accessibility concerns. For subsidized housing, if there's any kind of government funding, then that provider, the housing provider, needs to be the one to pay for reasonable modifications to make that housing accessible. That same requirement does not apply in private housing. So the tenant is going to be the one who is responsible for paying for those modifications, which can really add up. There's also an intersectionality aspect to this. Seniors of color are more likely to be cost burdened and more likely to experience racial discrimination on top of these accessibility issues. So these different issues can really compound on one another. And then finally, as I wrap up this section, older Americans have difficulty paying for housing and healthcare together. As I mentioned, the share of people that is dual cost burden, where their healthcare cost burden and housing cost burden, has really gone up over the last decade or two. Less than 4% of the U.S. housing stock meets basic accessibility requirements. In Oregon, it's probably lower. It's probably about 1% in the average city in Oregon, maybe less. And even though aging in place is a priority for the aging population, the last poll I saw said about 88% of older adults want to be able to stay in their neighborhoods. The infrastructure does not support sustainable growth right now. Okay, one quick question break, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gina. Yes.
About the tenant needing to, in market rate housing, carry the cost of the accessibility modifications. Can you clarify about that being in the unit or into the building? Because market rate building and specified to be.
Yes. Okay, so if the accessibility requirements for under the Fair Housing Amendments Act kick in at buildings with 4 or more units. So those types of buildings are going to be more likely to have accessible units in general. For a building without an elevator, it's the ground floor units. For a building with an elevator, the whole building should be accessible. So that part is not something that they're going to need to modify. Although I am actually not sure about buildings from before 1991. I would have to look into that because that's when those requirements kicked in. There might be someone in the room who knows the answer to that. Yeah, Alan. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So clearly, something that is going to need to, that is an issue and is going to continue to be an issue. But for other than that, in private market housing, yeah, it's going to be on the tenant to cover access issues. Although, yeah, I don't see a lot of situations where that's going to come into the public or shared space. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I missed what that was, the highest of.
Unhoused families. Unhoused families. It's the highest among the 50 states. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna hand it over to Gina.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to kind of take a deep dive into the protected class of disability. There are several different sets of laws that protect folks with disabilities. The majority of what we're going to talk about today are going to fall under the Fair Housing Act protections. However, there are a couple more sets of laws that also will occasionally apply. So Section 4 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is a set of protections that applies specifically to federally funded housing. So housing that's run by a housing authority. Essentially what this does is it requires these kinds of housing developments to affirmatively further fair housing. And this can look a lot of different ways, but the most significant way is that it allows these kinds of properties to offer reasonable accommodations for people without that tenant asking for them. In private market housing, reasonable accommodations are always initiated by the tenant or the applicant, the person with the disability. In federally funded housing that's run by a housing authority, they can offer reasonable accommodations to folks. And then, of course, there's ADA. So we get a lot of questions about ADA because there are some interesting overlaps with assistance animals under ADA and fair housing. I will very briefly touch on assistance animals in this presentation. If you have other questions about assistance animals, please come and find me after the presentation and we can chat about that because I know that that is a big, gigantic hot topic for folks right now. So why do we talk about disability? So about 50% of the contacts that we get at FHCO have to do with the protected class of disability, whether someone's being denied a reasonable accommodation, being denied access to housing. To put that in perspective, 15 to 20% of our contacts are race, color, and national origin together. And then 30% is everything else. So while age itself is not a state or federal protected class, there are certain jurisdictions like Multnomah County does have age over 18 as a protected class. In most places, age itself is not protected. So where we find the most overlap with aging adults is in the protected class of disability. So the definition of disability under the Fair Housing Act is purposefully very broad. It might be different than the definition of disability that you've heard under Social Security or ADA or something like that. But it is any physical or mental conditions that substantially impairs a major life activity, including walking, seeing, hearing, breathing, thinking, or caring for oneself. So as you can tell, this is broad and it's like that on purpose so that it can include as many people and as many conditions as possible. So some examples of what that might look like is it could be an ongoing chronic medical condition. So things like multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, schizophrenia, autism, seizure disorders, asthma, PTSD, ADHD, depression, or anxiety. So the big takeaway in the definition of disability is that it doesn't just cover medical or physical health conditions, it also covers behavioral health conditions and mental health conditions. So some additional protections is it also protects individuals with a history of alcohol or drug addiction. However, this does not extend to current users of illegal drugs. So we know that folks who have had previous substance use issues may have certain rental barriers. So things like problems with their eviction history, problems with their criminal history. This protection allows those folks to ask for those barriers to be overlooked with a reasonable accommodation. And we'll get into how that looks specifically in just a second. It also protects individuals with a history of a disability, even if they're no longer experiencing symptoms of that disability. So let's say, for example, somebody was in a really bad car accident 5 years ago. And as a result of that, they were unable to work for several months. And because of that, they, ran up their credit cards, and now their credit score doesn't meet the criteria for application. Even if they are not experiencing that disability currently right now, they can still ask for that credit history to be overlooked because it was directly related to their history of that disability. And it also protects individuals who are assumed to have a disability, whether or not they actually do. So this protection came into place during the AIDS epidemic of the late 80s and early 90s. Because folks would go into leasing offices and there might be something about them that makes them look sick, right? Like if they were very thin, or if there was something about them that maybe told the housing provider that they were part of the LGBTQ community, the housing provider would deny them housing based on the assumption that they had HIV or AIDS, right? So we see this come up quite a bit in shelters, which is kind of a separate issue, where people are denied for having odd behavior, and then the shelter provider will assume that they can't provide care for that person, right? So that is a protection under disability. So reasonable accommodation and modification requests are sometimes needed to restore equal access or enjoyment of housing for someone living with a disability. So a landlord might need to add something, remove a barrier, or make an exception to a policy, rule, or procedure. So this is referring specifically to rental housing. But if somebody owns a home that's within an HOA, HOAs are also required to make modifications or allow modifications and accommodations for folks, which they sometimes forget. So there are two different ways this can happen. The first is a reasonable modification, which is a physical change to a unit. These are things like ramps up to doorways, grab bars in the shower, lowered countertops in bathrooms and things like that, flashing smoke detectors. All that are considered modifications. So like Sam mentioned earlier, in private market housing, the burden is on the tenant to pay for the installation of these modifications, and landlords can request that the unit be returned to its original state after they move out, right? In public housing, this is a different story. As Sam mentioned earlier, in public housing, landlords do have that obligation to pay for the installation of these kinds of modifications. So on the other hand, we have a reasonable accommodation, which is an exception to a policy, rule, or procedure. So for example, landlords can have no pet policies all day long, but even in a no pet property, somebody can ask for an assistance animal, right? And that would be considered a reasonable accommodation because it's an exception to the no pet policy. It could also look like someone asking for a reserved parking spot if they have mobility difficulties, so that they can more easily access their unit. So reasonable accommodation or modification requests can occur at any time in the process. So someone can ask for reasonable accommodation at the point of application. They can ask for reasonable accommodation after they submitted their application and been approved for tenancy. They can apply for reasonable accommodation or modification during tenancy in their residence, as well as after receiving a termination or eviction notice. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about those instances in just a second. So there's no limit to the number of requests someone can make. So a landlord can't say something like, I've already granted you 3 requests, I'm not going to give you another one, right? Every single request that comes across a landlord's desk must be considered. Must be considered. If landlords are refusing to look at requests like that, that could constitute a red flag for sure. This process is usually initiated by the person with the disability, unless it's public housing, like I mentioned earlier. They have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, and in those kinds of circumstances, they can offer reasonable accommodations to people. But most of the time, this process is initiated by the tenant. That being said, all residents have to be able to meet the terms and conditions of the lease agreement. So a reasonable accommodation is not like a free pass for somebody to not have to follow the rules, right? These are requests that folks make so that they are able to follow the lease agreement. So I'm going to go through kind of what this process looks like during application, what it looks like during tenancy, and what it might look like after someone has received notice. So at the point of application, these are used to help with disability-related barriers to get into housing. So things like eviction history, rental history, financial history, right, that may impact someone's ability to access housing. So this request is used to demonstrate what has shifted or changed in a person's life since this barrier has occurred. So there's 3 parts to this. The first thing that a person is going to have to do is they're going to have to identify what the barrier is that they want overlooked. Then they're going to talk about what has changed. And what this really means is that they're going to have to talk about why this barrier is no longer going to be an issue for them to meeting the lease agreement going forward. And then they're going to have to provide verification both that they have a disability and that they're going to need to provide verification that they have made rehabilitative efforts, basically. So let's look at some examples. Let's say that somebody has poor rental history because they have an eviction due to hoarding disorder. So that might be a reason that a landlord might deny an application. But if they submit a reasonable accommodation with their application, they can ask for that to be overlooked. So maybe now, since this eviction occurred, they're working with a caseworker who helps to keep their collections orderly and sanitary and things like that. So then, with that request, they're going to have to submit a verification, which might look like a letter from that caseworker who provides that support for them. Another example could be someone who has poor credit history due to paying down medical bills with a credit card and then couldn't pay down the credit, right? So maybe since this time, this person is now receiving more income than they were before, or maybe previously they were unemployed, now they're employed, and all of their bills have been paid on time for a year. And then for verification of that, they would need copies of their paid bills and the receipt of their income. In this scenario, they would also have to verify the disability. So they might also have a letter from their physician verifying that they have a disability. Now, the really important thing to remember here is that housing providers cannot ask physicians or verifiers to give details about that person's disability. So if a housing provider is asking for a specific diagnosis, is asking for someone to describe their symptoms, that could be a red flag under fair housing law. Sometimes just by virtue of what the verification looks like, it does kind of give clues about what that disability might be. So like in the circumstance of criminal history related to addiction, it might look like that, right? So if their verification looks like a graduation certificate from a drug and alcohol program, then that is going to give away what their disability is. And that's just sometimes how it goes. However, the housing provider can't push for details about what their symptoms were, what their addiction was, things like that. So the last example is a criminal history example. Sometimes we do see assault charges related to previously undiagnosed disabilities. Maybe since this assault charge occurred, this person has established care, was diagnosed with their disability, and is receiving treatment and no longer displays behavior which caused the assault. That verification might look like a letter from their counselor or their doctor or their psychiatrist, or it could include a criminal screening, which doesn't demonstrate another conviction on their record, right? So that's kind of during application, what that might look like. During tenancy, it's going to look a little bit different. So this request is meant to help someone maintain their stable housing. So it's eviction prevention, essentially. So someone can ask, for example, for a reminder to pay rent on time if they have a disability that affects their memory. So this could look like a request that says, hey, landlord, if I haven't paid my rent by the 3rd of the month, can you call me and remind me to pay my rent, right? It could be asking for a reserved parking space or a live-in caregiver. So the thing about live-in caregivers, landlords can run background checks on them, but they should not be running credit checks on caregivers because caregivers are not tenants and they're not going to be paying rent, right? There's some. They could also ask for an assistance animal. The example here is for depression. Very, very briefly. Assistance animals under the Fair Housing Act is an umbrella term that we use that covers emotional support animals, companion animals, and trained service dogs. Under ADA, so a lot of people get this mixed up. ADA with service animals applies to public accommodations. So things like airplanes, the grocery store, hotels, stuff like that. ADA only protects trained service dogs or miniature horses. I don't know. Those are the two options. In housing, when we're talking about housing, emotional support and companion animals have exactly the same protections as trained service dogs do. So we're seeing more and more housing providers say things like, I don't accept emotional support animals. That is probably a violation of the Fair Housing Act, right? So look out for language like no emotional support animals, because that is not necessarily kosher under fair housing law. Okay. Reasonable accommodation requests can also be made after someone has already received a termination or eviction notice. So if the notice was caused by a symptom of a disability, that person can request a reasonable accommodation to remedy that violation and stay in their housing. So for example, let's say that somebody has post-traumatic stress disorder and they have night terrors related to that. In that instance, they might wake up in the middle of the night screaming and get noise complaints from their neighbors. And because of those noise complaints, the landlord is within their right to serve an eviction notice to that person. When that person receives that termination notice, they can ask for time to remedy the issue. Most of the time, when we're talking about reasonable accommodation requests after the point of eviction, we're going to be asking for time to remedy. So this person could say, these noise violations are directly related to my disability. Again, they don't have to disclose what that disability is. And then they're going to have to include their plan to remedy that issue. So they could say something like, I'm changing medications. Here's the date of my appointment with my doctor. They could say, I am going to be training a service animal to wake me up before I start screaming in the middle of the night. There are lots of different things that this person can do. They could also ask for a modification to soundproof their unit. It could look a lot of different ways. Another example could be harassment of neighbors. Sometimes when folks with behavioral disorders are relapsing, that can be an issue. And the landlord can serve eviction or termination notices for that behavior. But again, that person at that point can ask for time to remedy the issue and will have to include it. Now, the last one on here is hoarding disorder. And this could be an entire 2-hour presentation by itself. So I do sit on the Multnomah County Hoarding Task Force. And if you have specific questions about hoarding, please send me an email. And my email is going to be at the end of this presentation. And I also have business cards if you want that after the presentation. So I won't go into it right now. But hoarding disorder, you can also ask for reasonable accommodation for time to clear out collections. So they have to demonstrate how this request will remedy the lease violation. So with the example of hoarding disorder, someone might provide a timeline of how long it's going to take to clear out their collection. Now, the general consensus for that timeline, what we know is that it takes about 1 month per room in the apartment. or in the home to go through all of this stuff. And of course, that is a lot longer than most eviction notices give somebody to remedy their violation, right? So they can ask for that time as well. They're going to have to provide a plan, probably also contact information with whatever agency or support they're working with. That in this particular case, of hoarding disorder, the landlord can also ask to inspect the unit on a more frequent basis or something like that. So when requesting a reasonable accommodation or modification, this process is usually initiated by the applicant or the resident, so the person with the disability. It is best if done in writing. We always say that it is best to do these kinds of things in writing. However, verbal requests do also need to be considered, but it is good to do it in writing because then you have a paper trail and a record of when that was submitted. It's important to identify the request as a reasonable accommodation or modification and state that it's related to disability. So in the letter itself, using language like, I am requesting a reasonable accommodation to blankety blank, 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 right? That kind of just puts up a flag to the housing provider like, hey, there's legal weight to this. You have to look at this, right? It is also really important to include your verification with the request. Because if you don't include that verification, unless your disability is evident, if you don't include that verification, then the housing provider can deny it. What I mean by evident disability is like, let's say, for example, somebody's in a wheelchair. That is an evident disability, right? The housing provider shouldn't be asking that person for proof that they have a disability because it's obvious. And that would put an undue burden on that person to verify that. So we know, of course, that folks with disabilities are more likely to be cost burdened by their housing and are more likely to have trouble paying for these kinds of modifications. This is just a list of resources that you can go to for folks to help pay for those modifications. Some of them have income restrictions. So for example, refit is for homeowners specifically who have an income that is below 80% of the area median income. Some of, I would say most of these have income restrictions. Not all of them do. Sam, do you have anything to add about funding sources? Okay. Okay. Perfect. Okay. I'm actually going to skip this question break because I want to get into verification. Yeah.
So I just wanted to mention, I mentioned at the beginning that jurisdictions are also held to the Fair Housing Act, and that includes reasonable accommodations and modifications. So classic example, in order to travel, a person needs to have access to a bathroom at all time, and that means they need an RV. There are jurisdictions that ban RVs altogether. So the individual can make a reasonable accommodation request to the city to make an exception to that policy for, on the basis of their disability, to be able to park an RV at their home. Same thing goes for things like setbacks that a city has, under their building standards. Well, there are setbacks that would not accommodate a ramp. And so they need to make some kind of exception to their zoning code in order to have that ramp be made. So just one more example of parties that need to honor reasonable accommodations and modifications. Yeah, Alan. That is a question, yeah, and they're going to become more common. And I think that they have a lot of really great opportunities for things like residential homes and facilities. But I totally hear you that there are some open questions because this is not something that's been part of the housing ecosystem normally for a long time. So yeah, thank you for the question.
I lied and I heard a cry of despair when I said I was going to skip the question break. So I'll take a couple of questions. Go ahead.
I think grab our. Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think when we're talking about offering reasonable accommodations, it doesn't mean that they're gonna implement the accommodation without, going to the person first. It would just be, do you need this? You know what I mean? Um, and most of the time, I think the intent of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, the intent of this is eviction prevention. So like if somebody is harassing neighbors or something like that, and the housing provider doesn't want to evict that person, they might offer them the opportunity for reasonable accommodation. But yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for clarifying. Do you want to add anything to that?
Just in terms of the private market, when it comes to apparent disabilities, that's specifically about verification. So that it's not that the housing provider is proactively offering the accommodation. It's just that they're not going to ask the person who's requesting it to verify that they have a disability. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Mhm. That's a really good question. The diagnosis isn't necessarily the key piece. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Um, the question was, is uh does the diagnosis need to happen before they can ask for a reasonable accommodation after the eviction? Is that correct? Okay. So the answer is the diagnosis isn't the important part. It's their ability to verify the disability. So if somebody, for example, does not have a formal diagnosis, but has been working with a housing case manager who knows that they have a disability, that housing case manager may be able to write that reasonable accommodation request. And they don't have to disclose what that disability is. So the diagnosis isn't really relevant. They would just have to state that this person meets the definition of disability under the Fair Housing Act. Does that answer your question? Yes, they would need to be working with someone who could verify it. Yeah. Other questions before I move into more detail about verification? Okay. So what does verification look like? The big point of verification is it has to demonstrate a connection between the request and the disability. This could look a lot of different ways. It could look like a letter from a qualified individual. So we'll talk a little bit about what that qualified individual means in just a second. It could look like graduation certificates from certain kinds of programs. That could be, drug and alcohol programs, or something like that. Verification can be delivered via the tenant, the applicant, or the provider can send it directly to the housing provider, and by mail, email, or fax. So we do have editable forms online on our website, in our resource menu, that you can just plug in the details for that person and use that pre-written letter. So verifiers of a disability has to be a qualified individual who knows the person's situation, but it doesn't have to be a certified medical or mental health professional. Those are the strongest letters, are those from healthcare professionals, but it does not have to be this person. So that could be a housing case manager that this person is working with. It could be a religious figure that they receive counseling from, right? It does not necessarily have to be a physician. The verifier also has to state that the request is necessary for equal access and establish a connection between the request and the disability. Verifiers do not have to disclose the type of disability or the physical benefits of the request. So who can provide verification? These are just some examples. It's not an exhaustive list. So qualified individuals might be a doctor, nurse, counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker. And by social worker, that could be like an LCSW, or it could be someone like a case manager. Religious leader is on there, but it's specific to religious leaders who offer counseling to folks. Or a sponsor from a drug and alcohol program, or, group therapy leader, somebody like that. People who might be questionables, friends, coworkers, grocery tellers, cousin, parents. There's kind of an asterisk over parents, because if the parent is the person's live-in caregiver, then they can provide verification for that person. But in other circumstances, not so much. In red down here, we say we have online predatory sources. This is specific to assistance animals. I'm sure you've seen these around, these websites that are popping up that are like, if you pay $200, someone will call you and give you an evaluation, and then you can pay for them to write your letter. Housing providers do not have to accept these kinds of verifications. And the reason for that is that based on that 15-minute conversation that the provider has with the person, that provider can't claim to know the details of that person's disability, right? Because they only had one 15-minute conversation. So if someone is purchasing these letters online, while not necessarily, they're not like illegal, housing providers don't have to accept them as legitimate verification. And if they do receive one, they can ask for additional verification from a different source. It might also be beneficial to include account history showing credit repair if the barrier is related to credit history, treatment plans documenting progress, letters from employers, parole or probation officers or sponsors, or certificates verifying the completion of programs. We get a lot of questions about folks who are working with people who have sex offenses on their record. This is one of the convictions that can just be outright denied by housing providers, but a really helpful thing to have for obtaining housing for them would be a completion of sex offender treatment programs. That can be really big. All right, so what does supportive documentation look like? These are just some more examples of what verification might look like. So letters of reference from parole or probation officers, caseworkers, therapists, counselors, employers, teachers, or school officials. So when the landlord's looking at this kind of documentation, they're going to consider how long you've known the person who's writing the letter for you, how they know you, and if this relationship applies to the rental barrier you're trying to overlook. It could be certificates of completion from drug or alcohol programs or other kinds of rehabilitation programs, or tenant education courses, which can be very relevant in like eviction history type of barriers. So things like road to success, ready to rent, rent well, that kind of stuff. Other documents could demonstrate how your life has stabilized since the barrier occurred. So verification of employment, data related to rehabilitation or treatment programs, goals or plans showing progress. If you want to share like treatment plans with the housing provider, you're going to have to obtain a release of information from a provider to do that. Okay. So we've been using the word reasonable over and over and over and over again. What does reasonable mean? So these are the reasons that housing providers could deny accommodations. They can't deny accommodations because they're second guessing the verifier. We see this with assistance animals a lot, where housing providers will say, you don't look like you have a disability, or I just think you're working the system, so I'm going to deny this to you. Not a reason to deny. It concerns the tangible impact on the housing provider. So reasonable means that it's not an undue financial and administrative burden. The housing provider in this case would have to provide documentation that granting this request would literally put them out of business, right? Like they don't have the staff hours to grant this request, or they don't have the money for building to grant this request, things like that. And it needs to be part of the housing provider's job description. So if, for example, somebody with a mobility barriers has an assistance animal and can't pick up after the animal when it goes to the bathroom, and they request for the housing provider to do that for them, the housing provider could deny that because that's not part of their job description, right? However, this is really important. Anytime a landlord or housing provider turns down a request, it is best practice for them to have a conversation with the person with the disability and work together to come up with a reasonable alternative that works for both parties. Not legally required, but best practice is very encouraged. So let's say, for example, here are some examples. Marge, who suffers from chemical sensitivity disorder, has requested that the owner survey all the tenants in the building to determine the time of day and the chemicals they use to clean their units. She has asked that the owner compile this information for her on a weekly basis so that she can plan to be away from her unit at the time certain chemicals are used. So the issue with this request is that it will require an ongoing administrative burden that could not be handled by staff, right? So the reasonable alternative for this might be that the owner will notify Marge in advance before cleaning common areas and use non-chemical alternative cleaning methods where they are practical, right? Another scenario. So Gloria has a disability that impairs her ability to lift heavy objects. Due to this, she's unable to reach the top of the trash container to throw away her trash. She has requested that maintenance come to her apartment once a week and throw away her trash for her. So the problem with this request is it's not within the maintenance staff's job description to take out residents' trash for them. Also, it would pose issues with like, are they entering her unit when she's not there? Like that kind of thing. So the alternative might be that the property manager will install a smaller trash can next to the large dumpster. This way, Gloria can throw away her own trash once a week and maintenance can dump the smaller trash can into the big dumpster, right? So to kind of wrap up, housing providers should not be asking questions about the nature of somebody's disability or their diagnosis or details like that. They shouldn't be sharing information about a resident's disability with other residents, even if other residents are asking about it. So sometimes we will see like if there's a pet policy that says that you can't have a dog that's over 25 pounds and somebody has an assistance animal that's an 80-pound Rottweiler, right? Other residents might come to the housing provider and say, why does that person need to get to have a big dog when my dog doesn't get to be over 25 pounds? Even in those kinds of circumstances, housing providers can't say that's a reasonable accommodation because that's disclosing disability to somebody who doesn't need to know it, right? So housing providers are going to have to find a workaround for that. They shouldn't be requiring examinations by specific doctors or charging the applicant and tenant for this. This sounds ridiculous, but it's on here because it happened. They should not require that a verifier report that the accommodation is necessary to live independently. Living independently and equal access are two very different thresholds. Living independently would bar people who need living caregivers or assistance animals, right? They shouldn't be charging deposits for scooters, wheelchairs, caregivers, or assistance animals. Landlords can charge pet rent all day, every day, all they want. Those kind of charges should not apply to assistance animals. So housing providers should only ask questions related to screening criteria or the rental agreement. They should be keeping information confidential about disabilities. They can expect verification for that request unless the disability is evident, right? So if someone's in a wheelchair, if someone is using a seeing eye dog, that kind of thing. And they should be working with the tenant to find a reasonable alternative if they're going to deny a request. Okay. Questions? Yeah, the question is, does no pet deposit or pet rent apply to both emotional support animals and service animals? The answer to that question is yes. Yeah. It's okay. 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 Do you have any other questions? Yes. Yes. The question is, do you have an example of what to say if another tenant is asking about somebody's larger dog or, reasonable accommodation. The best example that Shile one time brought to me was a housing provider said different rules apply in different circumstances. And that's just the answer. Yes. Mhm. Mm. Yeah. Yes, it does make sense. So the question is, are there resources for housing providers to come up with reasonable alternatives to accommodation requests? This can get really creative. I don't know if there are specific resources. Sam, do you know the answer to this question? Okay. I don't know off the top of my head if there are specific examples, but there also is not like a specific set of guidelines of what that alternative would look like, if that makes sense. Housing providers can get really creative with that kind of thing. And it's encouraged that they don't have to come up with it by themselves, right? Like they can have a conversation with the tenant and come up with what's going to work for both of them. I'm sorry, that's not a more satisfying answer, but yeah. Oh, yeah.
Our education outreach director, Shile Reuter, is presenting in the next slot about mediation and fair housing, correct? Yes. And so that kind of collaborative process through mediation is a pretty good model for how to come to a reasonable alternative. Okay. We have a landlord hotline for housing providers who do have fair housing type inquiries. It is extension 2. No. Okay. You could call a regular line. It mentions it in the phone tree that there's a housing provider hotline. And you can also, we have an email address and we have a form on our website it's really easy to fill out.
Yeah. Yes. 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 So the question is, can we clarify the purpose of the 18 and over protection that's in some jurisdictions? So Sam, correct me if I'm wrong. The legislative intent of this was actually to protect college students. So in a lot of areas like Portland and like Eugene, where there's a high concentration of college students living in the area, there was an issue with landlords being like, I won't rent to anyone under the age of 22, right? Because they didn't want to rent to college students. And that was creating a lot of barriers for college students who wanted to live off campus. And so that protection was put in place for that. However, it does apply to everyone over the age of 18.
Are you talking about 55 and 65 plus? Okay.
Oh, you're talking about 55 and 65 plus. Oh, okay. So the other kind of age protection is that there is a legal loophole in fair housing that senior housing, so things that are specifically designated for senior housing, do not have to accept families with children to live there. This is specific to 65 plus communities. So in 65 plus communities, they do not have to allow any families with children or people under the age of 65 to live there. 62 to live there. In 55 plus communities, there's usually a designation of a certain number of units. I think it's about 20% of the units can contain families with children or people with disabilities under the age of 55. Yes. Yeah, that's correct. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, so yeah. Yeah, so there is a lot to this. Yeah, yeah. When we're talking about owner occupied rentals, yeah, the rules do change a little bit. I'm not sure how that specifically affects accommodations and modifications. The where that's really going to come into play is like in the screening process. And if there are shared facilities, then owner occupied units have the right to discriminate based on gender identity. Um, yeah, because if someone is sharing facilities like bathrooms, right? Then they, yeah, not if you're in a separate unit, correct. Um, okay. Any other quick questions before I pass it back to Sam? Great.
I think you might be referring to Mrs. Murphy exemptions, as they are colloquially called. So federally, there are exemptions from laws if a person if it's an owner occupied unit and there's it's below a certain threshold of units. In Oregon, in general, those don't exist. There's a specific example that I don't have time to get into because I need to wrap this up, but it has caused a lot of problems. This one small difference between state and federal enforcement has caused a lot of problems. But in general, everyone's got to follow all fair housing laws, regardless of whether they live in the unit or not. Okay, so we are at time. I'm just going to briefly talk about how fair housing laws are enforced. So we are a common first point of contact. We're not the only first point of contact, but we get about 2,000 contacts a year. About 70% of those issues we're able to resolve through advocacy. We have English speakers, Spanish speakers, and we can use the language bank for all other contacts. We have no income requirements in order to provide services to you because we're not a law firm or anything like that. And we can help file complaints with HUD or the Oregon Civil Rights Division through the Bureau of Labor and Industries. When we get a contact and it is determined to be a bona fide fair housing allegation, so this is definitely something that concerns fair housing, then we will follow up with investigative processes. So we will, try and get information about the discrimination. Did it actually occur? We've got investigation tools like testing. So testing is where you will send one applicant of a certain protected class in and then another person of a different protected class in, and they can compare notes. Basically, we can see, okay, were these people being treated differently on a protected class basis, and we can do those on the basis of specific complaints that we've gotten. And finally, we got to determine if it's a dwelling because there is a lot of gray area there. There are state and local enforcers, and you can also always reach out to legal aid services and other civil rights organizations. Disability rights organization is a great place to reach out to. What we know is that only about 1 in 10 discriminatory acts are reported. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Fears of landlord retaliations. If a person is undocumented, maybe they fear being reported to ICE. Sometimes people are just busy, but we know that a big reason is because people don't know their rights and responsibilities. And that's why these kinds of presentations are really important. And so we do a lot of these. There's a flyer on the table about a presentation that I'm giving in a couple of weeks through Portland State University about the State of Fair Housing Report, which is a big compilation of all of our data from the last 8 years. So I definitely recommend checking that out. That's going to be virtual. There's also evaluations on your table. I'd appreciate it if you filled that out. It just takes two minutes or less. With that, thank you very much. Have a great conference.